Okay, and welcome to Module 3. In this part, we're going to talk a little bit more about the creative side of things and more about your social media platform side of things. But for the first video, we're going to start off, as you can see, with the 5 top tips, how to create a KAPOW double exposure. So basically what that means is creating double exposures that are nailed are either in camera or out of camera in Photoshop and making them stand out and blend together. These are my 5 top tips that you can go for. You can go into them in more detail, but if you stay to these kind of core 5 basic values, you'll be able to execute them a lot easier, in camera especially, and out of camera you'll be able to put them together a lot easier, and they'll will fit in proportion rather than look all disproportionate and that kind of thing. I will show you a video after this one, how to do it in Photoshop. It literally takes 5 minutes to put one together if you shoot it right in camera the first time round. So the next, the next slide down. Obviously, is another double exposure in camera. These are all in camera double exposures. So tip number 1: shooting double exposures is about getting things into proportion to fit together as naturally as possible. The best way to achieve this is to use the same focal length or lens when you first start doing them. I mainly shoot my double exposures on my 35mm lens, and that's because I'm the most comfortable at shooting at 35mm than any other lens. So basically, in between the 2 shots that you're getting, whether it's in camera or out of camera, this applies to, you need to kind of sort your distances out, because the mistake that I see the most is where people kind of have one image far too close, one image far too far away, or they're shooting the same, the distances just aren't quite correct. So for it to work, you have to kind of get a comfortable little groove that you work in, and I did this at the very start. I've kind of spanned out now, but the best way to do it at the very beginning, if you've not done any at all, is to shoot with the same lens or the same focal length, especially between the 2 shots, because that way it all blends together nicely and you've got your distances correct. Okay, tip number 2. The next step to creating KAPOW double exposures is getting your distances correct, not just with your lens, but between the subjects that you're using. If you place one of your subjects too close, they'll become too large in the frame, and if you have them too far away, they'll look lost. So you'll lose all that KAPOW factor, because you will basically just have one lost image, or one image that's far too close and it just doesn't blend together nicely. I always try and shoot the first image with the correct framing, and in my instance it's usually the bride, so I shoot the bride first and keep her there so the dress is all laid out nice and neatly like we had seen in the first image, and then after that I kind of bring the groom in, and this is in camera, out of camera again, and I'm moving backwards or forward to see where it'll suit better. Like I said, if the first framing's right, it always works better. If you're struggling to do it together as one, for the first shot, what I always advise and tend to do is just shoot the bride by herself and get your framing right of the bride so your distance is correct, and then you can move on to the next step of working with them both for the double exposure. But the key to it is getting your distance right the first time round. So once you've shot her, I use the bride as an example here. You'll shoot the bride first, get your distances just correct, make sure you're happy with it in camera, and then make sure the dress is nice and neat, and then you can go, okay, now we're going to go for the double exposure. So then you can shoot for the bride and then the groom. Okay, so the next tip is tip number 3 after this one. I love this wedding here, so chilled. So tip number 3, lighting is key to get the separation between the images to make them pop. Especially most camera in double exposures don't allow you to change the exposure before the 2 shots, in most cameras I say. So this means you have to get the exposure perfect on your first image and adjusting accordingly to the second image until you get the correct balance. So for me, especially my bride and groom images like these, it's always important to expose for the bride correctly first. So when the groom does move closer, especially in this kind of double exposure, you can then bring him in accordingly whether you want him to be darker, a little bit lighter, and exposed for around the dress. For the very top double exposure that I did up here, this one just here, I made sure the bride was in the perfect lighting. I didn't just place her randomly in this field area and on this track. The lighting would just come out of a load of trees, and it was just hitting the bride's dress perfectly. So I knew if I exposed perfectly for her dress, then the groom, all I had to do was get it roughly. I think he was a little bit underexposed at the time because he was a bit more closer to me and closer to the shadows of the trees, which made it a lot easier to get that separation of the bride and the groom. So just be mindful on tip number 3. Make sure you get the lighting right for the first image, which is usually the bride, and then the second image, you can adjust accordingly as you go. But like I said, if you're doing it in camera, you can't change, in most brands of cameras, if not all of them I believe, you can't change the exposure between the two shots, so make sure the first one you get is correct. So just one more point on that. This one here, I shot for the castle first, so that was exposed correctly, and then we was shooting in near enough pitch black here, so I knew any settings that I had for the castle were going to be underexposed for the couple, which would make them a silhouette, which is what I was going for. So the first image was lit correctly. So moving on to tip number 4. I find double exposure become a lot more effective if you have a blank canvas on one or both of the images. Most of my images, especially in camera, I like to have the bride stand out, so I'll try to avoid having trees or any clutter in the background, or become distracting from the main subject, which is the bride and the dress in most cases. If you do use a cluttered area, try and place the main subject in a clearing like the image above. So what I did here, I knew we had a cluttered background and I wanted to work with a double exposure in this instance, so I made sure I placed her in the frame of the doorway so that she at least could stand out a little bit more and have that blank canvas in the background, if you like. I know we had all this clutter of the bar area here and more things over here, but I knew if I kind of got her in this doorway area, she would stand out a little bit more, which is always good. And then obviously I shot for the groom one again after with his pocket watch. This was one of my very first double exposures. So tip number 5. This is what I tend to do in my brain. You can do it on the floor if you want to. You can have little markers. So I set out 3 areas. So I, like I said, use tip 1 and 2 to help with this. Point A is yourself. So what I tend to do is I get my first shot of the bride in this example and I frame it up perfectly. So now I put my camera down or make a little mark on the floor and I know exactly where I'm shooting from. Okay. Point B is the groom. The groom will move in and out accordingly wherever he needs to be. And I get bride, point C, set and ready to go. So excuse me. So the only real part that we need to do is move the groom in and out. So I've got my place, the bride's got her place, and we're all set right for the shot that we're going to execute properly. And it's just the fact that the groom is the person who's going to move in and out to make sure that you can get them distances just correct, or that exposure just correct, especially if you're shooting it in camera. So set a marker on the floor where you are, which is usually I'll make a little line on the floor or put like my camera on the floor and then go and work with the couple. Remember not to change the lens or the focal length between the 2 shots because it will make things a little bit harder to do. You might be able to do it a little bit later on, but try and get the experience of shooting the same distances and the same focal length. If you need to, like I said, if you need to adjust the dress, you've got your marker, so you can then move off your area, which will be where you've put your camera down, and you can go and sort out the dress, sort out how you want to position the bride. And all you have to do is move point B, the groom, accordingly to the 2 shots. And it's as simple as that. So point A, B and C, and you just move the groom in and out where need be. Sometimes it might take 2, 3 times. If you're starting out, it might take a little bit longer, but as long as you get that shot and nail it lighting wise and distance wise, it becomes one of your standout images that you can have, something that's maybe a little bit different. I know people say it's 80s, but it can be a little bit different. And as you can see from the examples we've got here, it does work. It is something that's a little bit different. I've done multiple, even since shooting this video and making this slideshow, and it's just about getting that lighting right, and the distances right. And if you follow these 5 little tips, it might make things a little bit easier for you. In the next video that I'm going to record for you, I'm going to show you how to do it in Photoshop, and I will explain to you how I shot for the double exposure at the time.